In the morning, I finally understood what was killing me. I was standing in a parking lot outside a pawn shop on Yonge Street in Toronto, watching a stranger in a canvas work jacket hold my wrist under the winter light and say words that stopped my heart cold. "Sir, whoever put this ring on your finger wanted you dead." I didn't say anything. I just stared at him. And somewhere behind my ribs, something that had been trying to get my attention for 7 months finally broke through. My name is Gerald Whitmore. I'm 68 years old. I spent 34 years as an electrical engineer at a firm in Mississauga, raised 2 kids in a 3-bedroom house in Burlington, Ontario, and retired the autumn before all of this started with a pension, a modest investment portfolio, and a house that had appreciated into something considerably more valuable than what I'd paid for it in 1991. I wasn't wealthy by any dramatic definition, but I was comfortable, settled. The kind of man who didn't worry about money because he'd been careful with it his whole life. I had maybe $400,000 in registered retirement savings, the house worth somewhere around $900,000 in the current market, and a modest inheritance from my mother that I'd never touched, sitting in a GIC at RBC. By Canadian standards, in a city like Toronto, that made me something in the eyes of people who were struggling. It made me a resource. I just didn't know that yet. My wife Margaret passed away from ovarian cancer 3 years before this story begins. Her death reshaped everything. The house got quieter than I knew a house could get. The routines we'd built together over 31 years didn't quite work when only one person was performing them. I cooked for 2 out of habit for the first 6 months, and then stopped cooking entirely, living off frozen casseroles that neighbors kept bringing, and eventually off the kind of food you eat when grief has taken the edge off appetite altogether. My daughter Claire came back to Burlington more often after Margaret died. She'd take the Joe train out from Toronto and sit with me on the back deck, drinking tea and talking about her mother. My son Daniel, who lived in Etobicoke, came less often. He was busy. He always said he was busy. I accepted that the way fathers accept things about their sons without examining them too closely. The sickness started on a Wednesday in early February. I remember the specific day because I had spent the Tuesday evening reorganizing Margaret's things, finally going through the last boxes in the bedroom closet that I hadn't been able to touch. It was a hard night. When I woke up Wednesday morning, my stomach was wrong in a way I couldn't immediately categorize. Not nausea exactly. More like pressure, like something inside me had shifted. I lay in the February darkness listening to the wind off Lake Ontario come through the poorly insulated bedroom window, and waited for the feeling to pass. It didn't pass. It got worse. By 8 o'clock, I was in the bathroom and my body was doing things I hadn't experienced since a bad bout of food poisoning back in 2009. I gripped the cold edge of the sink and looked at myself in the mirror under the fluorescent light. The man looking back looked exhausted and pale. I assumed it was the previous night catching up with me. Grief does strange things to the body. Everyone says that. My doctor had said it multiple times in the 2 years since Margaret died. The mind and body are connected, Gerald. Give yourself time. Don't push yourself. I gave myself time. Don't push yourself. I gave myself time. The nausea passed by mid-morning, and I assumed that was the end of it. It wasn't. It came back the following morning. Then the one after that. I called my family doctor, Dr. Okonkwo, at the Tansley Woods Medical Center. His receptionist booked me in for the following Tuesday. I described my symptoms briefly, and she said what receptionists always say, which is that it sounded manageable, but to come in sooner if things escalated. They didn't escalate before Tuesday. They just continued, the same way and at the same time each morning, like my body had set an alarm for unpleasantness. Dr. Okonkwo is a patient and thorough man who has been my physician for 11 years. He ran blood work, checked my blood pressure, listened to my heart, pressed on my abdomen in a way that suggested he was ruling out something he didn't want to name directly. Everything looks normal, he said. Your white count is fine. Liver enzymes are fine. Kidney function is excellent for your age. He paused and looked at me over his glasses the way he does when he's about to say something I might resist. Are you sleeping? Not well, I admitted. He nodded. How's your appetite? Not great. He made notes. Gerald, he said carefully, You've been through a significant loss. Grief isn't just emotional, it's physiological. Your nervous system is still processing. This kind of morning nausea, sleep disruption, appetite changes, it's more common than people realize in men your age who've recently lost a long-term partner. He prescribed a low-dose antacid, suggested I try melatonin for the sleep, and told me to come back in 3 weeks. I went back in 3 weeks because nothing had improved. He ordered more blood work. Everything normal. He referred me to a gastroenterologist, a Dr. Sentiais Patel at Joseph Brent Hospital, who scoped me and found nothing. Healthy, he said, almost with a note of frustration, as if my stomach was being contrary on purpose. By March, I had lost 14 pounds. My clothes were loose. I had started losing hair in the shower, not the normal amount you brush off as part of aging, but thick bunches that collected in the drain and on my pillow each morning. My fingernails had changed. They looked dull and brittle, splitting along the edges in ways that Margaret would have noticed immediately and forced me to do something about. There were rashes appearing on my forearms that came and went without any apparent cause. My gums bled when I brushed my teeth. The headaches were constant, a low, deliberate throb behind my eyes that started around mid-afternoon each day and persisted into the evening. I would sit in the living room with the television on and not absorb any of it. Just sit there, enduring. Claire noticed. Of course she did. Claire noticed everything about everyone and always had. She'd arrived on a Saturday in late March, off the train with groceries and the particular expression of controlled worry she'd inherited from her mother. She set the groceries down in the kitchen and stood looking at me for a long moment before she said anything. "Dad, you look terrible." "Thank you," I said. "I'm serious." She came and sat across from me at the kitchen table. "How much weight have you lost?" "Some. I don't weigh myself." She reached across and touched my hand. Her face was doing something complicated. There was concern, obviously, but underneath it there was something I couldn't identify. Almost like she was calculating, working something out. "Dad," she said, "when did you start wearing that?" I looked down at my left hand. "The ring." "Daniel brought it at Christmas," I said. "He had it restored. It was your grandfather's. He thought I should have it since your grandmother passed." Claire's expression changed. She looked at the ring, then back at me, and said nothing. "He thought you'd want a piece of Grandpa with you," I said, and I could hear myself trying to fill the silence. "He said I should wear it every day. Sentimental reasons." Claire's jaw was tight. She said, "Sure." She said, "Of course." She said she was glad I had it. But her eyes hadn't moved from my hand. Looking back, I understand exactly what was happening in her mind that day. She'd already started to suspect. I didn't know that then. I was still deep in the comfortable blindness that comes from not wanting to see. Daniel had moved back to the house in November, 2 months after I'd retired. He needed to reset financially, he said. Toronto rents were punishing, and he had some debts he was working through. He said it as though it was temporary, a brief inconvenience before he got back on his feet. I said, "Of course, stay as long as you need." I meant it. He was my son. The spare room was empty, and I had more space than one aging man required. He was 39 years old. He worked in some capacity involving sales, though the specifics were always vague when I asked. He had the kind of confidence that reads as competence, until you've known someone long enough to notice the patterns underneath. He was charming in the way that people who need things from other people tend to become charming. He had Margaret's eyes and my stubbornness, and a habit of disappearing for days at a time without explanation that had been a feature of his personality since his early 20s. He brought me the ring on Christmas Day. It was the only gift he gave me that year. He'd driven over in the morning, and we'd opened presents together, just the three of us. The first Christmas without Margaret and brutal in the specific way that firsts, without people, always are. Claire had brought wine and cooked a proper roast. Daniel had brought the ring in a small wooden box lined with velvet. "Dad," he said, and his voice was careful and warm in a way that I found deeply moving. "I had this cleaned and restored. It was Grandpa's, his everyday ring, and I think he should have it. Wear it every day, would you? Don't take it off. It's a connection to him and to the family. I thought you could use that right now." I was moved. I won't pretend I wasn't. I put the ring on immediately, and Daniel watched me do it with an expression I now understand completely, but at the time read simply as love. 7 weeks later, the nausea started. By April, I was seeing a hematologist, a neurologist, and an infectious disease specialist. Dr. Okonkwo had expanded his referral network because the symptoms refused to align with any standard diagnosis. Each specialist ran their own battery of tests. Each one delivered the same increasingly baffling result. Your blood work is clean. Your cardiac function is strong. We can see you're unwell, but we cannot find an organic cause. Claire drove me to 3 of these appointments. She sat in the waiting rooms with her legs crossed and her jaw set and her phone face down in her lap. Not scrolling, not doing anything, just waiting. She asked good questions in the examination rooms. Specific questions. Had the doctors considered heavy metal toxicity? Had they run a full tox screen? The specialist would pause and look at her and say, "Well, we've run standard panels." She would ask what standard panels excluded. They would explain. She would nod and make notes on her phone and say nothing further until we were outside. "Why are you asking about heavy metals?" I said in the parking lot of the hospital one afternoon in April. She looked at me. Her breath made small clouds in the cold spring air. "Because you have a rash on your forearms that looks like a contact reaction," she said. "Because you're losing hair. Because your nails look the way they do. Because doctors keep finding nothing and your symptoms keep getting worse." She paused. "And because something doesn't feel right to me, Dad. I can't explain it more precisely than that. Something doesn't feel right." I told her she was overthinking it. I told her Dr. Okonkwo was excellent and thorough, and if there was something to find, he would find it. I told her I was probably just taking longer than expected to recover from the grief and the retirement and everything at once. She looked at me for a moment and then she said, "Okay." She said it in a voice that meant she was not going to argue with me, but she was also not going to let this go. That night, I lay in bed in the February dark that had become the April dark, and I looked at the ring on my hand. "My grandfather's ring," Daniel had said. I thought about my grandfather, a quiet man who'd worked the same auto parts factory in Hamilton his whole life. He'd given me a carved wooden box when I was 7 years old that I still had somewhere in the basement. I tried to remember whether I'd ever seen him wear a ring. I couldn't. I genuinely could not remember. I told myself that meant nothing. Memory is unreliable. Old men forget things about their fathers and grandfathers all the time. I told myself I was being paranoid. I closed my eyes and listened to the house settle around me and eventually fell asleep. What happened in May, I can describe precisely because Claire wrote it down at the time. She wanted a record. That was very Claire. She had come over on a Thursday, a day Daniel wasn't home. She came in through the back because she had a key and found me in the kitchen trying to eat crackers, which had become one of the few foods my stomach would tolerate. She put the kettle on and sat across from me and looked at me for a long time without speaking. Then she said, "Dad, I need to tell you something." I could hear in her voice that this was not going to be a pleasant conversation. She said she had done some research. She had started, she said, thinking about my symptoms in a different way after my questions at the hospital had been dismissed. She had gone online to medical literature, and she had looked up the specific combination of symptoms I was presenting with: the nausea, the hair loss, the nail changes, the rashes on the forearms, the peripheral headaches, the weight loss, the absence of any organic cause on standard blood work. She had found something that matched. She'd found it in more than one source, all of them pointing in the same direction. Arsenic poisoning, she said. Chronic arsenic exposure. I looked at her. The symptoms are a near perfect match, she said, particularly the pattern of the rash and the nail changes. There's something called Mises lines, she said, white bands across the nails that appear in cases of arsenic toxicity. Dad, look at your nails. I looked at my nails. There were faint white bands across several of them that I had been attributing to nutritional deficiency. The standard blood tests don't always catch it, she continued, particularly in cases of chronic low-dose exposure rather than acute poisoning. You need a hair analysis or a nail clipping analysis. Those retain evidence of exposure over months. Standard panels often miss it. I sat across from my daughter in my kitchen and let her words arrive. She was watching me carefully. She was waiting for me to understand what she was not quite saying directly. I said, "Claire." She said, "Yes." I said, "Are you suggesting that someone is doing this to me deliberately?" She didn't say anything. She just held my gaze. I said, "That's not possible." She reached across the table and picked up my left hand. She held it in both of hers and looked at the ring. Her hands were very still. "Dad," she said quietly, "when did you start feeling sick?" 7 weeks after Christmas, I said. She looked at the ring. She didn't look at me. "Have you ever taken it off?" she asked. "I promised Daniel I wouldn't." She pressed her lips together, set my hand down carefully, stood up and walked to the kitchen window and looked out at the backyard for a moment. When she turned back, her face was composed, but her eyes were very bright. "Dad," she said, "I need you to take the ring off right now. And I need you to come with me to see someone." I didn't argue. Something in her voice. Something I'd learned over 68 years to recognize as the sound of a person who knows something they wish they didn't. I worked the ring off my finger. It left a faint indentation on the skin beneath. I'd been wearing it for 4.5 months. Claire put it in a small Ziploc bag she'd brought in her purse. I looked at that and understood she'd been planning this conversation for some time. The person she took me to was not a doctor. He was a man named Arthur Beaumont, who ran a small antique jewelry and watch repair shop on Lakeshore Road in Oakville. He'd been Claire's client 3 years earlier, a design project for his storefront, and she'd maintained the kind of casual friendship with him that emerges from good professional relationships. He was in his mid-60s, compact and precise in his movements, with the calm of a man who spends his days doing careful work with small things. He held the ring under a jeweler's loupe for 4 minutes without saying a word. I counted. Claire stood beside me and said nothing. Her arms crossed, her jaw set in the way that reminded me so exactly of Margaret that my chest hurt. Then Arthur set the loupe down on his workbench and looked at us. "Where did you get this?" he said. "My son gave it to me at Christmas. He said it was my grandfather's, restored." Arthur was quiet for a moment. "It hasn't been restored," he said. "It's been modified." He turned the ring over in his fingers and pointed to a barely visible seam along the inner band. "This section here," he said, pointing, "has been separated and resealed. Very cleanly done. Someone opened this ring up and did something to the inside of it." He placed the ring in a small vise on the workbench and applied careful pressure to the seam with a specialized tool. There was a faint click. The inner band came apart in 2 pieces. Packed inside the hollow interior of the ring, wedged along the full length of the inner band, was a dark, chalky compound. It looked like putty. Arthur did not touch it. He leaned close and looked at it under the loupe, then straightened and looked at it. Under the loupe, then straightened and looked at us. "I don't know exactly what this is," he said, "and I want to be careful about that. But I can tell you what I think it looks like based on how it's been packed and the texture of it. It looks like an arsenic compound, possibly arsenic trioxide, the kind of thing that would absorb slowly through the skin over months of continuous wear." The kitchen of the world stopped in that moment. I heard the sound of the heating system in the shop, the distant traffic on Lakeshore. Claire put her hand on my arm and kept it there. "This was done deliberately," Arthur continued. "This required knowledge and planning. This is not accidental. Someone knew what they were doing." I looked at my hand, the indentation where the ring had been. 4.5 months. "My son," I said. Arthur looked at me. "My son gave me this ring." Arthur was very still. There was a silence that lasted a long time. Then Arthur said very quietly, "You need to call the police right now, and you need to get a blood and hair analysis done today if you can manage it. Not tomorrow, today." Claire already had her phone out. Her hands were shaking slightly. She was not crying, but she was close. "Dad," she said. "I know," I said. "The Burlington OPP detachment is on Guelph Line, a 15-minute drive from my house." Claire drove. We had the ring in its Ziploc bag, and Arthur had provided a written statement on his shop letterhead describing his findings in technical detail. Arthur had also, without being asked, documented everything with his phone, and shared the photographs with Claire on the drive over. The officer who took our initial statement was a constable named Rawlings, who had the patient, careful manner of someone trained to hear difficult things without reacting to them in ways that made them worse. He led us to a quiet room and listened to everything. He asked clarifying questions. He wrote things down in a way that suggested he was taking this seriously. When I was done, he left the room for several minutes and returned with a detective. Detective Andrea Perrone was somewhere in her mid-40s with short dark hair and the composed, evaluating expression of someone accustomed to situations that didn't resolve simply. She sat across from us and asked me to repeat everything from the beginning. I did. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she looked at the Ziploc bag on the table between us, at the ring inside it, and then at me. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, "I'm going to ask you directly. Do you believe your son intended to cause your death?" I sat with the question. "Yes," I said. "Do you know why?" "I think about his debts," I said. "He mentioned debts when he came back to the house. He was always vague about money. The house is appreciated significantly. I have savings. He knew the details of my estate because we'd discussed it after Margaret died." Detective Perrin nodded. She was writing steadily. She arranged for a blood draw that afternoon at Joseph Brant Hospital. She contacted the Ontario Forensic Pathology Service regarding the compound inside the ring. She told me they would have preliminary results within 72 hours. She told me that based on what I had described and what Arthur's statement indicated, she was treating this as a potential attempted murder investigation. She also asked me not to contact Daniel. She said this carefully and seriously. She said they would be speaking with him in due course and that it was important he not be warned. I understood. I agreed. They confirmed arsenic in my bloodstream 3 days later. The concentration, combined with the 4.5 months of continuous wear, was consistent with what they'd call chronic low-level poisoning, the kind that mimics a dozen other conditions, defeats standard blood panels, and accumulates quietly in the body over time, breaking things down slowly from the inside. The forensic analysis of the compound inside the ring confirmed arsenic trioxide. The ring itself, when examined more closely, had micro-perforations along the inner band, tiny, deliberate holes that allowed the compound to contact the skin continuously through moisture and heat. Arthur had been right. This was not amateur work. Someone had researched this. Someone had planned it. My own son. Claire was with me when Detective Perrin called with the confirmation. She sat on the couch across from me and watched my face as I listened. When I hung up, she didn't ask what they'd said. She could read it. "I know this is hard," she said. I looked at my hand. The indentation was mostly gone by then, but I could still feel it somehow, the phantom weight of what had been there. "He wanted the house," I said. She nodded. "And the registered savings." She nodded again. "He came back in November," I said, and I could hear myself working through it, and Christmas was 6 weeks later, and he gave me the ring. He'd been planning it before he moved back in. Maybe that's why he came back. Claire said nothing. She was holding her own hands in her lap, very tightly. "Did you know?" I asked her. "Before you figured it out, did any part of you know?" She thought about it honestly, which was very clear. "I knew something was wrong with you that wasn't illness," she said. "I knew the nausea didn't start until after Christmas. I kept coming back to that. I couldn't make myself say it out loud until I had something more than a feeling." "I'm sorry," I said. "I don't know why I said that. I suppose I meant I was sorry she'd had to carry that alone." "Don't," she said. "Don't apologize. You didn't do anything." Daniel was arrested on a Tuesday morning. Detective Perrin had called me the evening before to tell me it was happening at 8 a.m. She asked if I wanted to know. I said yes. I didn't sleep. I lay in the house that had been quiet for 3 years and listened to the dark and thought about my son as a child, the way he'd been as a boy, how he'd been afraid of dogs until he was 12, and had wept openly at Margaret's funeral without caring who saw. I thought about how we become capable of the things we become capable of. I thought about Margaret and whether she'd suspected anything in him that I'd missed. I thought about how the human capacity for self-deception is nearly without limit. At 8:15 in the morning, my phone rang. It was Detective Perron. "He's in custody," she said. He didn't resist. "Thank you," I said. "There's something I should tell you," she continued. "When we executed the search warrant on his room, we found documentation. He'd been researching your estate for months, insurance policies, property assessment, beneficiary designations. He'd also been in communication with someone about a secondary approach if the ring wasn't working fast enough." I said nothing. "We found a powdered substance in his desk," she said. "We're having it analyzed, but it appears consistent with an arsenic compound as well. Something he may have been planning to introduce more directly. He was going to accelerate it," I said. "That's what it looks like." I hung up and sat at the kitchen table where I'd sat 10,000 times with Margaret, and I looked out at the backyard that was turning green finally with the Ontario spring, and I breathed in and out until the feeling in my chest became something I could carry. The trial ran through October and November of the following year. The prosecution presented the ring, the forensic analysis, the blood results, the search history on Daniel's laptop that showed months of research into arsenic toxicity and estate law, the text messages between him and a contact whose identity was never fully established where he had discussed timelines. Claire testified about finding me deteriorating over months and about her research and about taking me to Arthur. Arthur testified about the ring's modification and what he'd found inside. The forensic pathologist testified about the compound and the mechanism of absorption and what the cumulative exposure would have produced in another 3 to 6 months. Daniel's defense argued no direct evidence existed that he had personally packed the ring. The lawyer was competent and thorough. The jury was not persuaded. The deliberate modification of the ring, the research history, the financial motivation, the communication about timelines, the secondary substance found in his room, taken together they formed a picture that the jury found convincing without requiring direct proof of the act of assembly. The judge sentenced him to 18 years. I sat in the courtroom and watched them take my son away and felt something I still don't have a precise name for. Not satisfaction. Not grief exactly, though grief was part of it. Something more like the feeling of a very long silence finally becoming silence it was supposed to be, instead of the false silence of something being hidden. Claire drove me home. We didn't talk much in the car. When she pulled into the driveway and turned off the engine, we sat for a moment in a way that people who have been through something together sometimes sit, not needing to fill the space. Then she said, "Do you still have the ring?" I told her it was evidence, that it would be retained by the court for the duration of the appeal period. She nodded. "Good," she said. "I don't want it anywhere near you." The recovery took longer than I expected and shorter than the doctors predicted. The arsenic was in my system in sufficient concentration that they prescribed chelation therapy, a process that took several months and had its own discomforts, but which worked. My hair grew back slowly. The rashes cleared. The nausea, which I hadn't realized had become the baseline rhythm of my days, was gone within 6 weeks of stopping exposure. I ate properly for the first time in nearly a year. I slept through the night. My weight came back. My energy came back. The headaches disappeared. I stood in the bathroom one morning in December, almost exactly a year after the Christmas that had changed everything, and looked at myself in the mirror and saw, for the first time in a long time, something that resembled the man I remembered being. I called Arthur Beaumont that afternoon and took him out for lunch at a restaurant on the water in Oakville. He was modest about it, the way skilled people who have done something important often are. He said he'd just noticed what was there to be noticed. I told him that noticing what was there to notice had saved my life, and that I would not minimize that by calling it simple. He accepted that without argument. We have lunch together twice a year now. I have thought many times about what I would say to Daniel if he were in a room with me. I have rehearsed it in the way you rehearse things that won't happen, trying to find the version that feels honest. I have not settled on what I would say. What I know is that I would not ask why, because I already understand why, and understanding why does not require him to explain it to me. He needed money he couldn't earn on his own, and he looked at his father and calculated what I was worth. The why is not complicated. It is just terrible. What I have settled on, after a long time and with difficulty, is that I won't spend the years I have left carrying him as a weight in my chest, not because what he did was forgivable in any ordinary sense, not because my anger at him is not real and not justified, but because I refuse to let the poison he put in me from the outside continue working its way through me from the inside. He tried to take everything. I won't give him the part that remains. I sold the Burlington house in the spring. It was time. Claire helped me find a smaller place in Hamilton, a good neighborhood, a manageable yard, close enough to her that she can stop by without it being an event. I have a morning walk along the waterfront that I take most days when the weather allows, which in Ontario means roughly 8 months of the year. I stop at the same coffee shop on King Street where the counter staff know my order. On a clear morning in March, I can see across the lake from certain points along the trail, and on those mornings, I think about how close I came to not having any of this, not in a morbid way, in the way that a person who has come back from something thinks about the distance they traveled with gratitude that the distance was survivable. With clarity about what the remaining distance is worth. I was saved by a man who knew his craft well enough to see what others couldn't see. I was saved by a daughter who paid attention when everything in her wanted to look away. I was saved by the simple accident of timing, by Arthur being the person Claire thought of when she needed someone who could tell the truth about small, careful, hidden things. Trust the people who pay attention. Trust the people who say something even when it would be easier to say nothing. Trust the voice that tells you something doesn't feel right, because that voice is trying to save you, and sometimes that's the only thing that will. I was 68 years old, and my son tried to end my life for the value of the house I'd spent 30 years paying off and the savings I'd spent a working life building. He almost succeeded. He would have succeeded, I believe, if my daughter hadn't been the kind of person who sits in waiting rooms, face down with her phone and asks the questions no one else thinks to ask. I'm still here. That's the whole of it. I'm still here. And on good days, which are most days now, that is more than enough. There's something I've thought about many times since all of this ended. Not the trial, not the sentencing, not even the moment Arthur opened that ring on his workbench in Oakville. What I keep coming back to is a much quieter moment. It was a Saturday in March, while I was still sick and still didn't fully understand why, and Claire was sitting across from me at the kitchen table asking questions I didn't want to answer. She wasn't pushing. She was just paying attention in the steady, careful way she'd always paid attention. And I kept deflecting, kept reassuring her, kept saying I was fine. I had it handled. The doctors were on top of it. I wasn't fine. The doctors weren't finding it. And I didn't have it handled at all. What I had was a very old habit of assuming that the people closest to me wished me well. That assumption had served me for 68 years, and had never had serious cause to question it. But assumptions we never examine become blind spots. And blind spots, if we're unlucky enough, become the exact space through which harm enters. Daniel didn't become capable of what he did overnight. Looking back now, I can trace the shape of it. The vagueness about money that I'd excused as privacy. The returns to the house that were always framed as temporary but never quite resolved. The way he'd ask about my estate planning with a casualness that I'd read as maturity and now understand differently. I didn't miss these things because I was foolish. I missed them because I decided somewhere below conscious thought that a father's love for his son entitled him to a son's love in return. That's not how it works. That's never been how it works. Love is not a transaction that balances automatically. It requires attention, honesty, and the willingness to see clearly even when clarity is uncomfortable. The lesson I carry isn't about suspicion. I don't want to spend the years I have left treating the people around me as suspects. That would be its own kind of poison. What I carry instead is a commitment to staying awake, to not smoothing over the things that don't quite fit, to listening when someone I trust tells me something is wrong, even when every part of me wants to argue otherwise. Claire told me something was wrong for weeks before I let myself hear her. Arthur saw what was hidden in 30 seconds, because he'd spent 40 years training himself to see clearly. The capacity to see clearly is not a gift you either have or don't have. It's something you build through honesty and practice. and the willingness to be wrong about things you'd rather be right about. I also carry something about resilience that I didn't fully understand before this. There were mornings during those 7 months when I genuinely did not believe I was going to recover, not just physically. The deeper damage was the collapse of a story I'd been telling myself about my family, about what I'd built, about what I'd meant to the people I loved. Rebuilding after that kind of damage is not dramatic. It doesn't happen in a single moment of clarity. It happens in small, deliberate choices to keep going, to eat breakfast, to take the walk along the waterfront, to call Claire on a Thursday for no particular reason. The accumulation of ordinary days, chosen deliberately, is what recovery actually looks like. What Daniel did was a choice. What Claire did was also a choice. What Arthur did was a choice. And what I do now, every morning I wake up in the Hamilton house with the lake light coming through the bedroom window, is also a choice. I choose to be here. I choose to remain curious about the world. I choose to believe that the people who showed up for me are the true measure of my life, not the one who didn't. That's enough. On most days, that is genuinely more than enough.